Hi, welcome to the Nonprofit Mastermind podcast, where every week I do a deep dive into the strategies and mindset behind launching, scaling, and leading a high-impact nonprofit. I'm your host, Brooke Richie-Babbage. Working to make the world a more just and beautiful place is messy, complex, heart-wrenching, and ultimately deeply joyful and fulfilling work. And none of us can do it alone. That's why I started this podcast, this Mastermind community, to hold space for and share the learnings and the questions and the grapplings and the actual concrete strategies that allow us to move our social impact work forward together. So welcome to the Mastermind. I'm so glad you're here. So as we know, it can be really tough, especially for smaller nonprofits, to find or force yourself to create time to take a step back and look at how the institution itself is doing. Being stuck in the weeds, as they say, is a perennial problem. How do I keep my eye on the whole forest when I have to be down here on the forest floor, fighting my way through the weeds? Everybody struggles with this. I remember very, very acutely that this was one of the biggest challenges I had when I was running my organization. And it's by far the biggest challenge that the executive directors that I work with deal with. There is so much work to do in the organization. It can feel impossible to find time to work on the organization. So what do I mean by getting out of the weeds? And how do you do that? What is this magical way to actually be on top of the forest or looking at the whole chessboard, whatever sort of metaphor you really like for yourself? In this episode, I'm going to give you 3 concrete strategies for getting out of the weeds in your own organization. And these are strategies that I have not only used myself, but that I rely on and coach and teach and train, and they work really well, and they're super concrete. Now, 2 of them I've actually talked about in previous episodes, and the 3rd I'm going to walk through here. So I'm going to reference the other 2 sort of in the context of everything and go slightly deeper into the 3rd strategy. So that you have them all together, I've actually pulled the 3 sort of get out of the weeds episodes together into a little playlist for you. And you can get that at richiebabbage.com, get out of the weeds. Really simple, richiebabbage.com, get out of the weeds. So all 3 of the strategies that I'm going to talk about today, each of the 3 podcast episodes where I do a deep dive into them will be in that playlist. I'm going to reference 2 of them today, and then the 3rd I'm going to walk through, do a sort of deep dive here. So to start off, I want you to think about the 3 kinds of work that you need to do as a leader. There's a framework that I really like that I'm going to share with you. So I call the framework the grounded action framework, and it basically organizes thinking and work into 3 sort of levels, and each one is grounded in the previous level, hence grounded action. So the 3 levels are generative thinking and work, strategic thinking and work, and tactical thinking and work. And most of what we do, not just organizationally, but sort of in life, can be organized into these 3 buckets. And all 3 are important if you want to balance your work within the organization. If you want to sort of think about your leadership in terms of this framework, there's generative work, strategic work, and tactical work. And insofar as those 3 things are balanced, then you can have a good sense of like, okay, I'm sort of keeping everything afloat. So think of the framework like a slope. At the top of the slope is generative thinking and work. This is big picture thinking. This is what I talk with the EDs in my program all the time about wanting more time for. Vision work, planning work, values. What is the organization about? How are we showing up in the world? What values and principles are important to our work? Are we actually living our values and principles as we expand our programming, as we bring new staff people on board? I had a great conversation in my group coaching program a few weeks ago about hiring in a way that stays values aligned, right? So how do we make sure that if I'm adding 3, 4 people to my team, that I'm doing that in a way that will keep my culture intact, right? That's a generative question. Are we staying true to ourselves and our mission? Now, this can be the hardest thing to find time to do, right? This can be the hardest bucket to work on because it feels the fuzziest, right? Least tactical, least rubber on the road. But it's super important in setting the framework for literally everything else that the organization does. Everything that you do, all of your strategic decisions, all of the tactical decisions you make, they grow out of, they are grounded in this generative thinking and work. So you have to find time to do this work. When we talk about what does it mean to get out of the weeds, this is the first thing that it means. It means finding time for generative thinking and generative work. So then the middle of the slope is strategic thinking and work. This is about how you carry out the generative principles, the mission, the vision, and the values. This is the level of thinking that turns your vision, that turns your mission, your values into an actual plan. This is where you start thinking about priorities, navigating problems and challenges. So you have figured out what it means to build the kind of staff culture, right, that you're trying to build, and what the pillars of that culture are, the values that are going to guide your collective work as a team. And you and your staff have done a lot of thinking to be on the same page about this. So now what are you actually going to do? Right? How are you going to weigh pros and cons to figure out the best way forward as you operationalize those values? What will that mean you're going to prioritize in your hiring? What will that mean you're going to prioritize in the meetings that you keep on your calendar and take off of your calendar? It's the strategizing and the cost benefit analysis, right? That's this level of thinking. And so as you think about what it looks like to be out of the weeds, you can see why it's really important to also have time to be thinking at a strategic level, right? What is the best way forward, weighing all of our strengths and our weaknesses and our opportunities and our threats and the pros and the cons of this decision. So you have to have time for strategic thinking and work. Now, the third bucket is the bottom of the slope of this grounded action framework, and that is tactical thinking and work. This is all about execution, tasks to be carried out, specific steps that need to be taken. This is the level where you're thinking about the specific policies, for example, that you need to draft to implement your new approach to hiring, or a new policy that you need to draft to craft compensation in a way that's more equitable. It's how you will actually operationalize the strategies, the strategic decisions that you made in the second bucket. Now, each of these modes of thinking and work are super important. Generative thinking sets the framework, strategic thinking crafts the plan to organize the work, and tactical is about execution. You may find that you spend more time in one as opposed to the other two, right? That makes total sense. Most of us are more comfortable with a particular type of thinking, engaging work. I find that I'm really comfortable, if you think about that slope. My natural inclination is to sort of center myself or ground myself right as generative thinking turns into strategic thinking. I'm really comfortable sitting in sort of the messy open space of generative thought, but I turn fairly quickly to, okay, this is super interesting. What's the through line here? Right? This is really, the messiness is exciting and there's so many ideas and who are we and why do we care about the things we care about? And then I immediately turn to, okay, what are we going to do? What does this mean we have to prioritize? Oh, but wait, we have these things to prioritize that we've decided we want to focus on. How do these things calibrate? How do these things balance one another? I really like that sort of transition from generative to strategic. What I find I will naturally, I'm not going to say avoid, but I have to actually build in time to force myself to do some of the tactical thinking, right? Now, I want to say tactical work doesn't mean you doing the execution. Tactical thinking and work in this bucket is determining and being really clear about what execution looks like. And that's a really important distinction, because I'm not saying that you do the generative thinking and planning, visioning, you do the strategic decision making, and then you execute everything. The tactical thinking and work in this framework is still you above the forest, above the chessboard. It's you not in the weeds. You're not executing necessarily. You are making sure that what is executed, the steps that are taken, are in line with the strategies and the generative approaches. So the key here is to remember that all of these are important. They build off of and respond to one another, right? So let's say you're thinking about impact. Impact for your organization, sort of a broad concept. At the generative level, you might think about how you define impact, right? Whether you want to define impact on the girls that you serve in your program in terms of numbers served or depth of transformation, right? So breadth and depth require different types of strategies and resource allocation. You can absolutely have both. Many organizations do. But the more you move in one direction, for example, towards wanting to reach 1,000 new students in the next year, for example, the more resource intensive it is to also have deep personal transformation for all 1,000 of those students. So defining impact at the generative level is really important, because once you've identified that core definition of impact, let's say it's breadth, then you need to map out what that means in practice. How will you get to the numbers you're looking for? What strategies will you use? How will you reach the girls in your program? Through partnerships, through their parents, through their peers, right? Those are really different strategies, different strategic approaches, now that you've defined in a generative level the type of impact that you care about. What type of engagement will you have with them to ensure that they're achieving the outcomes you want? How will you track and measure outcomes? What will you do with that data, right? These are all sort of things that fall into the strategic bucket that grow out of or are grounded in your generative definition of impact. Now, finally, once you have your program strategies in place, your outreach, your engagement, evaluation, you have to think about tactical execution. Now, like I said, this is not you being in the weeds. It's not you executing. It's being clear about which tactics organizationally are to be used. What is the staffing you're going to need? What is the curriculum going to look like? What partnership contracts are you going to need if you decide strategically you're expanding through partnerships? So as a leader, you have to have time away from putting out fires, away from facilitating staff meetings, so that you can engage with each of these levels of thinking and work. And you don't have to do it alone, right? You may have thought partners in the generative work. You may work with your leadership team or the directors in your program at the strategic level. You may delegate the crafting of the tactical work to somebody on your team, but each of the buckets has to be engaged with. And you don't want to spend too much time in any one space because, like I said, they build off of one another, right? If all you do is generative thinking, then you miss the ability to work with your team to map out really exciting ways forward. And sometimes people will feel lost on your team, right? Similarly, if everything you think about is at the tactical level, and I work with a lot of leaders where that piece is clearer, right? Where they can see what execution looks like, which policies they need, what the staffing model should look like. It's easy for people on your team and your board and even yourself to feel lost because those tactical decisions don't feel contextual. They're devoid of the bigger picture, the generative framework or the strategic narrative that makes them make sense. So the struggle or the work, it's not always a struggle, but the work is to strike a balance between the three. And that balance striking, unfortunately, never ends, right? That is a key part of what it means to lead, particularly a growing organization. So the three strategies that I want to highlight are ways to bring each of these modes of thinking and work into your life. So the first is about how to create space for generative thinking. Again, this is the level of thinking where purpose and mission live, where you're able to think about the kind of organization you want to build, the kind of staff culture, the kind of board culture, the next level of impact you want to have. Now, my suggestion here is to schedule an annual personal retreat or CEO day, We plan board retreats, we plan staff retreats to create space for sort of values-based and generative work with the people on our team. Do it for yourself, for you as leader. Plan a half day or a full day retreat for you as the CEO of your organization. Now, I did an entire episode about this called The Power of the CEO Day. Did it last November. It's like a mini training on how to structure and conduct your own CEO Day, why they're so powerful, how transformative they are for you as a leader and for the organization. And I have included a link to that episode on the Get Out of the Weeds playlist. So you'll find that in the show notes for this episode and on that playlist. I also have a more in-depth toolkit on crafting and conducting your own CEO Day inside the Nonprofit Leadership Resource Hub, which is a monthly subscription of resources and live Q&A trainings with me. And you can access that at richiebabbage.com/nonprofit resource hub. Now, one thing I want to say about the CEO Day is it's not a personal day. You want to treat the CEO Day the same way you would a staff retreat. It is a day to engage intentionally in generative thinking for your organization. And often, depending on how many hours you have, a really great way to give yourself time to engage in all three of those buckets in a clear, aligned way, to do generative thinking, to see how the strategic thinking is rooted in the generative thinking, and to develop a tactical plan in one or multiple areas of your organization, sort of all at one time. You want to identify your objective for the day, plan an agenda, and execute the same way you would any retreat. So I talk about that in The Power of the CEO Day, and that is in the playlist, richiebabbage.com/get out of the weeds. Okay, strategy 2 is about how to bring in time for strategic thinking, bucket number 2. And this is outside of, say, a strategic planning process. This is about carving out time for strategic thinking and planning and problem solving on more of an ongoing basis. And that can be really tough for the same reasons that doing generative thinking can be tough. Here, I recommend hosting brain trusts for trusted advisors and stakeholders in your organization and in your network. Now, generally speaking, a brain trust is a convening of well-informed advisors and experts on a particular topic who are brought together to advise you on a specific strategic challenge or set of issues that you are grappling with or for your organization. Now, the idea of bringing together a group of close advisors who have sort of specialized knowledge or specialized skills or expertise or a way of thinking, this is not new. But as a term of art, brain trusts are most associated with, and I'm a total history buff, I was a history major, I love this, associated with FDR, who regularly pulled together a group of expert advisors during his presidency, and together they played a key role in helping to shape his thinking around the New Deal, right? These are people who are thought partners, and you aim them at a specific strategic question or challenge. Now, for our purposes, we are not planning the New Deal necessarily, maybe you are, but for our purposes, think of a brain trust as a stylized meeting or mini convening. You want to aim for about an hour and a half, and it brings together people that you consider to be experts, advisors, people you'd like to be your advisors, to help you think through and strategize around a particular problem. Now, I did an episode, this is the second sort of episode in the playlist, that walks through this, and it's called A Fun and Powerful Cultivation and Network Expansion Activity. I did it in August of 2022. And I talked about brain trusts as a really powerful cultivation strategy, but it is also, at the same time, a really powerful way to provide a dedicated strategic thinking space for you and your team. So I walk through what brain trusts are, how to set them up in the episode in the playlist. And inside the Resource Hub, I also have an entire brain trust toolkit with an implementation guide, model agendas, etc. So finally, the third strategy that I recommend. This is one for engaged tactical thinking, and it's one of my favorites. It's super easy to do. It's a listening tour. I used this strategy from year one of both of the organizations that I started and grew. And I actually still do this inside my current business. It is so simple and so powerful. The basic idea here is to have 2 or 3 meetings or coffees every quarter with people who can help you learn to do something better, people who can shape your tactical thinking. So think of 3 or 4 things you want to know how to do or how to do better. Identify a few people who you think know the answer to your question. You're going to reach out to those people and ask if they would have a coffee with you about a specific organizational question. Now, a couple things to note. A, these are not people that have to be in your space. They can be in a different sector. They can be in an organization that does completely different work. Remember, this is about expertise and experience. Who are the people that know the answer to your question at a tactical level and can give you insight and expertise, period. You don't have to know them. And in fact, this is a great way to begin to build your network around a particular issue or type of work that you're doing. And you basically want to do this 3 or 4 times a year. Pick one question a quarter, let's say, and set up 1 or 2 coffees. Then repeat 3 or 4 months later. That's it. This is a super simple strategy. And I cannot emphasize enough, really, really powerful. Some of the most impactful partnerships that I built in the early years of my organization here in New York City were through these listening tours. In addition to getting access to concrete, tactical insights in the short term, sort of answers to questions and great ideas that even helped identify blind spots I didn't even know I had, I've built professional relationships that have resulted in funding, that gave me access to people to invite to cultivation events, that introduced me to people in new sectors, mentors, advisors, really powerful relationships. So these are 3 strategies that I recommend. If you were to do 1 CEO day, 2 brain trusts, and 2 listening tours in a year, and actually get them on your calendar, just like that, you have a full year of planned strategies that create space for you to come out of the fray and think about your organization as an entire entity. Now, one last thing I'll say is that there is no silver bullet here. Making time to work on your organization is always going to be tough. It's going to be work. It's part of the work of leadership. But as I'm sure you know, you got to do it. It's super important. Doing it doesn't have to mean hours upon hours every week. You can use simple strategies like these to integrate different modes and levels of thinking into your work throughout your week, throughout a month, and definitely throughout a year. Okay, so as a reminder, you can get the entire playlist with the mini trainings on CEO days, brain trusts, and listening tours at richiebabbage.com/get-out-of-the-weeds. And you can get the CEO Day and Brain Trust implementation toolkits inside the Resource Hub membership at richiebabbage.com/nonprofit resource hub. That's it for today. I will see you back here next week for more Mastermind. Thank you for joining me for this week's episode of the Nonprofit Mastermind podcast. If you liked this podcast, I would also love for you to subscribe on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. And if you think that what we talk about here could benefit another leader in your life, please share with your friends. Finally, if you'd like more leadership in your life, you can sign up for my weekly 5-minute read Leadership Forward 321 newsletter. I send articles, resources, and inspiration every week curated around a leadership theme to help you lead your nonprofit better. You can sign up at richiebabbage.com/leadership forward 321. That's it for this week. Thank you for joining me, and I'll see you back here next week for more Mastermind.